بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. أما بعد، فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. The section which we are going to look at in this week's lesson in Arabic is entitled as Babu Sujudi Sahw, which in English means the chapter regarding the error of prostration. Now, in this particular chapter, we are going to look at another important aspect of salah, of prayers, and that is that if someone was to omit any of the obligatory actions of salah, then by omitting these obligatory actions of salah out of forgetfulness or accidentally, that does not break your salah. But instead, the Sharia has said, the ahadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam dictates that if somebody was to make a sajda sahwa, a prostration for the error, then that will rectify the error which he had committed in the salah, and there's no need for him to start the salah and the prayer all over again. Now, before we look at the text which is in front of us, I'll firstly mention 7 principles or usuls, or some rules that if somebody was to remember these rules and these principles, then he will know exactly when to do this prostration for error and when exactly he does not need to make the prostration for error. Now, the first usul or the first principle is, number 1, if any wajib or obligatory act is omitted, then the prostration of error, the sajda sahwa, becomes obligatory. Now, let's look at obligatory acts of salah. Now, if you remember when we did the salah section many weeks ago, I mentioned those things which are considered to be wajib and obligatory in salah, and also those things which are considered to be sunnah in salah. Now, what this particular principle is telling us is those things which are obligatory in salah, such as the recitation of Surah Fatiha, the At-Tahiyyat, the first sitting in a 3-rakat salah like Maghrib, or in a 4-rakat salah like Zuhr, Asr and Isha. If somebody was to omit these actions out, and remember these actions has to be omitted out of forgetfulness or by mistake. Because if somebody was to omit any obligatory or wajib actions out intentionally, that he intentionally did not read Surah Fatiha, or he intentionally just skipped the first sitting, the Qaidah Ula, then sajda sahwa, the error, the prostration of error would not be sufficient, but instead he will have to start his salah and prayer all over again. So remember, the first principle, the first usul, is that if any wajib act is omitted, like the reciting of Surah Fatiha, or like the omitting of a surah after Surah Fatiha, or the omitting of, say, Dua Qunut in the Witr Salah, the omitting of the first sitting or the At-Tahiyyat, then by doing a sajda sahwa, a prostration of error at the end, then that would be considered sufficient, and that would be considered valid for the salah to be accepted and for the salah to be done. The second principle, the second usul, is that if any wajib act is displaced, sajda sahwa, the prostration of error, also becomes obligatory. Now, what we mean by wajib act being displaced, it means doing a particular wajib act in a place where you shouldn't be doing it. So just say, for example, if somebody recited Surah Fatiha in the sitting position, in the position where he should be reciting At-Tahiyyat, or like say, for example, somebody recited At-Tahiyyat in the standing position where he should have been reciting Surah Fatiha, or after reciting Surah Fatiha he should have recited a surah, but instead by mistake he recited At-Tahiyyat. So if any wajib act is displaced, then sajda sahwa, the prostration of error, would also become obligatory. The third principle, the third usul, is that if any wajib act is delayed for the duration of 3 subhanallah, if any wajib act is delayed for the duration of 1 rukn, i.e. for the duration of 3 subhanallah. Now say for example somebody recited Surah Fatiha. Now after reciting Surah Fatiha, it is wajib, it is obligatory that one recites a surah afterwards. Now if somebody after reciting Surah Fatiha thought to himself, okay, what surah shall I read next? Shall I recite Surah Alam Tara Kayfa Fa'ala Rabbuka bi Ashabil Fil? Shall I recite Surah Al-Fil? Shall I recite Surah Al-Quraysh or Surah Ikhlas? And he was thinking about what to recite, and the next thing you know, 3 seconds have elapsed. So in that situation, sajda sahwa, the prostration of error, would be obligatory on that person. The fourth principle, the fourth usul, is that if any wajib act is repeated, if any wajib act is repeated, so something which is wajib, so if somebody was to repeat that, then sajda sahwa would be obligatory. So just say, for example, in the first sitting, somebody recited At-Tahiyyat, thereafter he then recited At-Tahiyyat again. Or like say, for example, somebody repeated the Qaida, the first sitting, somebody repeated the Surah Fatiha, then in these situations, sajda sahwa and the error, the prostration of error, would be obligatory. The fifth principle, the fifth usul, is that if any wajib act is altered, so something which is obligatory, if it is altered, then again sajda sahwa, the prostration of error, would also be obligatory as well. An example of a wajib act being altered is, as all of you know, that it is wajib and obligatory. And remember, this is only wajib and obligatory if the salah or the prayer is being performed in jamaat and in congregation. So, as all of you know, for the Fajr prayer, for the Maghrib prayer, for the Isha prayer, reciting the qira'at, i.e. the recitation, vocally and audibly, is a wajib, is an obligation, is obligatory. Now just say for example, if an imam by mistake started reciting the Fajr quietly, or the Maghrib quietly, or the Isha quietly and in a soft tone, then sajda sahwa would be obligatory. So that's an example of a wajib act being altered. That where you're supposed to be reading it loudly, you read it quietly, and where you're supposed to be doing quietly or in a soft tone, you do it loudly, then sajda sahwa would be obligatory. The sixth usul, the sixth principle, is that if any farz act is displaced, and remember this carefully, if you omit a farz of salah, your salah is not accepted. So So just say, for example, qiyam, standing is farz, bowing down, that is farz, sajda, prostration, that is farz. Now if somebody was to miss out, say, ruku, if somebody missed out 2 sajdas, 2 prostration are farz, but if somebody missed one of them out and he did the other, and then he finished his salah and prayer in that way, his salah and his namaz would not be done. However, if somebody, say for example in the first rakat, he forgot to do 1 sajda. So there were 2 sajdas, 2 prostrations. He did one, but he did not do the second one. And then he stood up for the second rakat. Now the ruling is in that situation is that from the standing position in the second rakat, he will now go down and perform the second sajda, the second prostration, and then he will come back up to the standing position for the second rakat, and he will start the second rakat again from Surah Fatiha and from a surah. Remember, if you miss out something farz in salah, something compulsory in salah, but you manage to then do it later on, say in the second rakat or in the third rakat, so because that farz act was displaced, i.e. you did it in a place where you're not supposed to have done it, then because of that displacing of the compulsory act, what would happen is that in the last sitting you will have to do a prostration of error. And lastly, the 7th principle, the 7th usul, is that if a farz act is repeated, then again sajda sahwa, the prostration of error, is obligatory. And what I mean by farz act being repeated is in terms of, say there are 2 sajdas which are obligatory, but if somebody did 3 sajdas, then he will have to do a sajda sahwa and an error of prostration of error at the end. Remember, if somebody did 3 sajdas, that doesn't break the salah. It's only when you've done 1 and then you complete the salah, that's only then your salah will not be accepted. If somebody did 3 or even 4, where he's supposed to have done 2 but he did 4 or even 5, by increasing the number of sajdas or prostrations, your salah doesn't break, but instead if at the end if you were to do a prostration of error, then your namaz would still be valid and your namaz would still be accepted. Now if we keep the aforementioned 7 usuls or 7 principles in mind, we can derive the following rulings. That number 1, if somebody after reciting Surah Fatiha, he recited Surah Fatiha again, so sajda sahwa, i.e. the error of prostration, would be obligatory. Yeah, straightforward, because as I mentioned, any wajib act which is repeated, you will have to do a prostration of error. So Surah Fatiha he recited, which was wajib and obligatory. Thereafterwards he then recited Surah Fatiha again. So because of the obligatory and the wajib act being repeated, sajda sahwa would also be obligatory on that person. Another example which we can derive is that if a imam or a person is leading the prayer, or even if he's praying by himself, if he got stuck, so he was reciting, say, Surah Fatiha, and afterwards he was reciting a surah and he got stuck, and if he got stuck and he is silent and quiet for the duration of 3 subhanallahs, sajda sahwa would be obligatory. However, if he got stuck and then he skipped, say, a verse or a page and then he went on to another page, or when he got stuck he kept on reciting the very same verse over and over and over again, then irrespective of how many times he is reciting the verse over and over again, sajda sahwa would not be obligatory. So just keep that in mind. If the imam gets stuck or you get stuck in salah, as long as you're reading something, even though it could be the same verse over and over again, or even though you may have missed or skipped a large chunk of the pages or of the paragraph, and then he got onto another ruku or another section or another para, and then he started reciting. So by doing that, sajda sahwa would not be obligatory. However, if you get stuck and then you're quiet, you're silent, nothing is coming out, and there's a lapse of 3 subhanallah, 3 seconds, then sajda sahwa would be obligatory in that situation. Another ruling here is if a person in the first sitting, after reciting at-tahiyyat, is supposed to get up. But if after at-tahiyyat he started reciting Durood Ibrahim by mistake, he started reciting all of Durood Ibrahim or the dua, thinking it was the last sitting, but in reality it was the first sitting, and then he realizes and then he stands up, then sajda sahwa would be obligatory. And the reason why sajda sahwa would be obligatory in that situation is because there has now been a delay of the farz act being performed, and the delay here was that after you recite at-tahiyyat, then you should stand up straight away and pray the third rakat, which is farz, which is compulsory. But because there was now a delay in performing the farz, in terms of that person after reciting at-tahiyyat, he by mistake kept on sitting there and started reciting the Durood Ibrahim and the duas, then that would not be, then in that situation the prostration of error would be necessary. If, say for example, somebody after at-tahiyyat just said Allahumma salli or Allahumma salli ala, and then he realized that this is the first sitting, and if he was to get up straight away, sajda sahwa would not be obligatory. However, if he said Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, if he recited the word Muhammad, and then he realized, then sajda sahwa would be obligatory in that particular situation. Another masla or another ruling here is if somebody made the same mistakes, i.e. if he omitted the things which are wajib and obligatory, not in farz salah, but in optional salah, in optional prayers, then again the same ruling applies in terms of the prostration of error is also obligatory at the end of the salah. The reason why I'm mentioning is that some people may think, well, this prostration of error should only be there for the farz prayer and the wajib prayer because they are farz, they are wajib. So if somebody was to miss out any, or if somebody was to make an error, if somebody missed out a wajib or something obligatory, then only for those prayers you reckon there should be a prostration of error. However, in optional salah, because it's optional, so if somebody was to miss out something wajib obligatory, then it shouldn't really matter whether he does the prostration of error at the end or not. Remember, the rulings are the same, whether it's farz or whether it's a nafal or optional. That is, if you were to miss out something obligatory and wajib, whether it's the farz prayer, whether it's the optional or the nafal prayer, sajda sahwa is necessary and is obligatory in both situations. Now we're now going to look at the text which is in front of us from Imam Quduuri Rahmatullah Alayhi's Mukhtasar. And Imam Quduuri Rahmatullah Alayhi begins this section of Babu Sujud Sahw by saying Sujud Sahwi wajibun fi ziyadati wa nuqsan ba'da salam yasjudu sajdatayn thumma yatashahhadu wa yusallimu, which means that the prostration of error is obligatory fi ziyadati wa nuqsan. Now ziyadati wa nuqsan basically means whether there is an increase in the salah in terms of he makes 3 prostrations instead of 2, he recites Surah Fatiha twice, one nuqsan, or there is some kind of deficiency in the salah in terms of omitting Surah Fatiha in terms of omitting a surah after Surah Fatiha. Ba'da salam, so after the salam and prostration, so you make one prostration. So this is basically the procedure of performing the prostration of error. So you make one salam to the right, ba'da salam, yasjudu sajdatayn, and you will perform 2 sajdas or 2 prostrations, summa yatashahhadu wa yusallimu, and after you perform the 2 prostrations, you will then get back up again. You will then recite the tashahhud, i.e. at-tahiyyat, the durood Ibrahim, the dua, wa yusallimu, and then you will complete your salah by making salam to the right and then to salam to the left. So remember, it's only when you come to make the prostration of error, you make one salam to the right. Thereafterwards, you're going to make 2 prostrations. Thereafterwards, you will then recite the at-tahiyyat, the durood Ibrahim, the dua, and then you make salam to the right and also salam to the left. The next paragraph or so, Imam Quduuri Rahmatullah, he then explains when the sajda sahwa, this prostration of error, become obligatory. So he mentions that if somebody was to miss out something which is wajib or obligatory in salah, he then goes on to say, أو ترك قراءة فاتحة الكتاب, that if somebody was to omit the recitation of Surah Fatiha, wal qunut, if somebody missed the reciting of Dua Qunut, Allahumma inna nasta'inuka wa nastaghfiruka, what we recite in the 3rd rakat of the witr prayer just before we go into ruku, or with tashahhuda, if somebody was to omit the recitation of at-tahiyyat, or takbirat al-eidain, if somebody missed out the 6 extra takbis, according to Imam Abu Hanif rahmatullah alayh, the 6 extra takbis of the Eid Salah, the 2 Eid Salahs, Eid al-Fitr and also Eid al-Adha. So again, if somebody missed them out, and it is possible sometimes in the morning when Eid Salah takes place, you may be a bit tired, the adrenaline sometime may get to you. So what could happen is that in the first rakat where you're supposed to be doing the 3 extra takbis, you could easily miss them out, you forget doing them, and then you go straight into the Surah Fatiha and the Surah. So again, أو تكبيرات الإيدين, if somebody missed the takbis, the Allahu Akbar, the extra takbis of Eid al-Fitr prayer and Eid al-Adha prayer, again sajda sahwa, the prostration of error, would be obligatory. And it goes on to say that if the Imam recites loudly in those prayers where he's supposed to be reciting quietly, or vice versa, if he recited quietly in those prayers where he was supposed to be reciting loudly, sajda sahwa would be obligatory and would also be necessary as well. In the next text, Imam Quduuri Rahmatullah alayhi goes on to say, وَصَحْوُ الْإِمَامِ يُوجِبُ عَلَى الْمُؤْتَمَ السُّجُودِ, which basically means that if the Imam was to make a mistake, then that mistake in terms of performing the prostration of error will also transfer onto his followers and to those who are praying salah behind him. Now remember, and I mentioned this before as well, that in the Hanafi fiqh, it's considered that the Imam, he is actually forwarding the salah of the followers to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore, if the Imam prays his salah correctly, then the followers' salah would also be correct as well, even though they individually may have made some mistakes. But the Imam's salah would be correct. Because the Imam's salah is correct, the followers' salah would also be correct as well. Similarly, if the Imam was to make a mistake in salah, if he missed out a wajib or an obligatory action in salah, then that wujub and obligation would also pass on to the followers even though they themselves individually did not make that particular mistake. So remember, if the Imam is making the prostration of error, the followers would also have to make the prostrations of error. However, it then goes on to say that فَإِن لَمْ يَسْجُدِ الْإِمَامِ, if the Imam does not make the sajda, then the followers will not make sajda. And similarly, just say for example, if the Imam made a mistake and it was quite blatant and clear that he made a mistake, he missed out a wujub or obligation, or he did something which required the sajda sahwa and the prostration of error. Just say for example, it was Maghrib Salah, but he recited it quietly, or it was say Dhuhr Salah and he started reading loudly. So everyone behind knew that the Imam had to make a prostration of error, but for some reason the Imam didn't do it. So the ruling goes on to say Lam yasjudil mu'tam, the followers behind would not make the prostration of error. And he then goes on to say فَإِن صَحَ الْمُؤْتَمْ لَمْ يَلْزَمِ الْإِمَامَ السُّجُودُ وَلَا الْمُؤْتَمْ السُّجُودُ, that if the followers were to make a mistake, then there is no prostration of error for the Imam to make, and also not for the followers and for the Muqtadi. Now this section brings me on to a question which sometimes people ask. Is just say for example, somebody had to perform error, a prostration of error, a sajda sahwa, but for some reason he forgot to perform the prostration of error, he forgot to perform sajda sahwa, and heaven behold, what happened, he makes the salam to his right and to the left. So basically he finishes his salam by doing salam, and then he remembers that he had to do the prostration of error. Now in that situation, the ruling is that if he did not do anything which was munafi li salah, so if he didn't do anything which went against the principles of salah, if he then did the prostration of error, then his salah and his namaz would be accepted, and there's no need for him to repeat the salah again. So I'll give you an example. Just say if somebody had to do a prostration of error, he forgot and he did salam to the right and left. Now if after doing salam to the right and left he remained in that position, he didn't turn his chest away from the Qibla, he just remained there, he was probably engaged in some form of dhikr, some form of tasbih, and then he remembered that he's supposed to have done the prostration of error. So in that situation, what will he do is that he will quickly perform the two sajdas, the two prostrations. He will get back up again, recite the tashahhud, the at-tahiyyat, the durood Ibrahim, the dua, and finish off his salah in that particular way. And if he was to do that, then his salah would be accepted and there's no need for him to repeat the salah again. The next batch of rulings, Imam Quduuri rahmatullah alayhi, he explains what a person would do if, say for example, he missed the first sitting, the Qaida-ul-Ula, and then he remembered. What does he do? Does he return back to the first place, or does he do something else? And does he have to do prostration of error? Now it's mentioned that if somebody forgetfully or out of mistakes or accidentally, he did not do the first sitting, so he did the first two rakats, he's supposed to have sat down, but instead what happened was that he stood up for the third rakat, and then he remembered, summa tazakkara. Now the ruling is that if he is more closer to the sitting position, he will then sit back down again, he will then read the at-tahiyyat, and then he will continue with his salah, and there's no need for him to do a sajda sahwa and a prostration of error. However, if he was more closer to the standing position, ila hal qiyam aqrab, then the ruling is that he should not return back to the sitting position, but instead he will continue with the salah, he will continue with the third rakat, he will continue with the fourth rakat, he will then do a prostration of error in the last sitting in the qaida akhira, and he will complete his salah in that particular way. Another ruling here which the author mentions is if a person missed the last sitting and he stood up for the fifth rakat, or if a person sat down for the last sitting, but after at-tahiyyat, after reciting at-tahiyyat, thinking that it was actually the second rakat, he then stood up for the fifth rakat. Now, what would he do in that situation? We will inshallah find out now. The ruling basically is that if somebody read 4 rakats, and after doing the second prostration, the second sajda of the 4th rakat, he should have sat down for qaida akhira. But what happened was that he then stood up for the 5th rakat. Now the ruling is that if somebody now in the 5th rakat does one sajda of the 5th rakat, he then goes on to say that the farz, i.e. the 4 rakats farz which he had prayed before, that will now become annulled, that will now become cancelled. He will then have to add another rakat, i.e. a 6th rakat, onto the 4 previously, and tahawwalat salatuhu naflan, and all the rakats will now be considered as nafal. So let me explain again. So after doing the second prostration of the 4th rakat, he should have sat down for the final sitting, but instead by forgetfulness he stood up for the 5th rakat. Now the ruling is that if he now performed the sajda and the prostration of the 5th rakat, then the 4 rakats which he had previously prayed before with the intention of nafal is now going to become annulled and cancelled. And he is now obliged to add another rakat, a 6th rakat, and all the 6 rakats would be considered as nafal and would be considered as optional. And the reason why you may be thinking that isn't this a bit harsh, that the 4 rakats which he had prayed before, it's all going to be considered cancelled, gone down the drain. The reason why is because there's a ruling in the Hanafi fiqh that farz and nafal cannot join up together. Like under one takbir tahlima, in the same salah, you cannot mix a farz salah with an optional salah. So because of that reason, because in this situation here, what's he done is that he's actually mixed the 4 rakats with the 2 rakats, but in between rakats 4 and 6, there wasn't a qaida akhira. There wasn't what we call the final sitting, the at-tahiyyat, which is farz. So what he had done is that before he could complete the farz and the compulsory acts of salah for the first salah, which is the final sitting, before he could do that, he then started the optional salah. So because of that reason, the 6 rakats or the 4 rakats or however many rakats he prayed before would be considered to be cancelled. However, if it was the other way around, where he prayed 4 rakats, and then after praying 4 rakats, he sat down for the at-tahiyyat, for the final sitting, he recited the at-tahiyyat, and remember, by reciting the at-tahiyyat or sitting for the duration of at-tahiyyat in the last sitting, it is though that you have done the farz of salah. So then what happened was that by mistake he then stood up for the 5th rakat. Now the ruling goes on to say that if he now performed the sajda of the 5th rakat, so along with the 5th rakat, he will now be obliged to add an extra rakat so that it becomes 6 rakats. So in this situation, first 4 rakats would be considered as farz and compulsory. His obligation is compulsory, the farz would be done, and the extra 2 rakats would be considered as nafal, would be considered as optional. And the reason why in here we can differentiate and say, okay, these 4 rakats are farz and these 2 are nafal and optional is because what I explained before is because in this second scenario he had managed to complete the compulsory, the faraiz of salah. And the faraiz and the compulsory of salah was to perform the last sitting, the qaida akhira, the final sitting. And because he had done that, so now if afterwards, if he was to join 2 rakats of optional prayer by mistake, by standing up for the 5th rakat, then that is okay. The 4 rakats would be considered as farz. The zuhur or asr or isha, that would be accepted, and the extra 2 rakats which he read, that would be considered as optional, and that would be considered as nafal. We leave it there for this week. May Allah give us the tawfiq and the ability to act upon what has been said. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.